Really excited to be here and talking about human risk quantification today, um, specifically deep diving a bit on Living Security's take on human risk and how we quantify threats and behaviors in the organization. Just a little bit about me. I've been working in the cybersecurity space for about 10 years now. I'm currently leading the data engineering and data science efforts here at Living Security. Um, yeah, I've been here for about 3 years, but before that, I worked in the user entity and behavior analytics space for about 7 years, which, for those of you familiar with the space, a lot of overlap with some of the challenges and the types of data that we interact with in the human risk management space. But I think the big difference is, and what kind of brought me on board several years ago to come work on this product with Living Security was the focus on the human and really trying to take all of these sources of disparate data in the security ecosystem, bring them together to build a holistic view of risk about the individual, groups of individuals in the organization, and the enterprise itself, ultimately with the goal of driving actionable insights and actionable plans and workflows to try to bring that security culture and security posture for the organization in line and improve it. So we've all seen, I'm sure everyone here has seen these types of stats. This one's from the Verizon data breach report that came out this year. These are, 60% of breaches globally involve some non-malicious human action. This is huge. It points to, the human being a core component of data breaches and risk in the organization. And traditionally, there have been a lot of solutions to address this, right? We've had security awareness training for years. Phishing simulations are a popular way of educating and addressing risk in the organization, as well as targeted monitoring solutions, whether you're monitoring email, a DLP product, monitoring web access, things like that. And all of these help. They've all got their own place, but we know that they're not enough. There's still a big gap in risk, and that needs to be filled. And you know what? Like the question is why? I mean, what's stopping us from being able to intervene in some of these risks? And I think a big part of it is just the vast ecosystem of tools and the different mechanisms by which threat can be introduced into the organization. This is just a small kind of view into the variety of different tools that are out there. We've got DLP, your Windows logging events, web activity, mobile activity, and so on. And each of these tools can be a great resource for protecting against threats, protecting risk, reducing risk in a particular dimension. But it's difficult to analyze holistic risk without getting a picture of the individuals in your organization across the entire landscape, the threat landscape here. One of the main issues is taking all of these disparate sources of data and kind of untangling and identifying the same user, the same human across all of these different tools, and building a holistic picture of risk for the individual and ultimately for groups in the organization. So that's where Living Security's Unify Intelligence platform comes in. We're aiming to do that identity resolution, that linking across all of these different tools in the threat landscape, and estimating and predicting the likelihood of the vulnerability of risk and vulnerability due to vigilance or lack thereof, as well as the impact of that risk and vigilance in the org. So what I want to do is deep dive a bit today on the Human Risk Index, our proprietary quantitative approach for assessing risk for individuals in the org. And here's just kind of an overview of the landing page in the application that you'd see, showing a score of 430 for the organization. This is a credit score like score that ranges from 1 to 1,000, 1 being highly risky on the left side of that dial, 1,000 being highly vigilant, and neutral in the middle, meaning our model can't make a decision one way or the other if there's any risk or vigilance. We have a variety of different techniques for kind of monitoring this over time and looking at trending analysis of that score, and then breaking it down into segments in the organization. You can see a few of those below based on job title or groups of the same office location or that share department. And I really want to just kind of hone in on how we get to that 430, what goes into that, what types of metrics are we interested in monitoring to calculate that score and bubble it up to highlight pockets of risk. So when we first, several years ago, when we first started talking about the Human Risk Index and what we wanted it to represent, we had a lot of guiding principles or functional goals. And this is just a few of them. It's not exhaustive, but I think it highlights some of the main things we wanted to capture when building out this methodology for quantifying risk. The first is that we want to be able to prioritize individuals by their risk and their vigilance. A lot of tools out there focus or kind of hyper focus on the risky side of things, but we also want to be able to reward vigilant activity and detect when there's opportunities for vigilance, maybe that are being missed by people in the organization. We also want to be able to distinguish between behavior versus threat risk factors. What I mean by that is behavior really corresponds to those activities and actions that the user has control over. Are they reporting a phish? Are they rotating their password regularly? Are they avoiding malicious or blocked websites? Versus threat, which is the risk factor that includes inherent risk to the organization. It's still important, but it's not always something that the user has any control over. So being targeted repeatedly by real phishing attempts, or even keeping their endpoint detection and response tools policies up to date is something that might be controlled by the security team, and the user doesn't have any control over it. It's certainly a risk if you find pockets in the organization that aren't adhering to those policies, but they may not be able to do anything about it themselves. I've mentioned already, we want to be able to aggregate this so that we can compare teams to one another. We can compare individuals to one another and ultimately organizations. And lastly, we wanted the score to be something that's explainable and interpretable. When I see that someone has maybe a score of 250, I want to know specifically what are the behaviors or threats that are causing that score to come down, and be able to propose steps to improve that entity score, or at the aggregate level, propose steps to improve whole groups of individuals' scores and target those pockets of risk. So just kind of here, I want to go through the data flow. How do we get from raw activities on the left to ultimately our human risk index on the right? So on the left, we're starting with the raw activity. These are the high throughput logs and alerts that you'll typically get from most of the security vendors that I was kind of talking about initially. These are the primary inputs to all of the starting point for all of our analytics. Generally, these can be a bit noisy, but useful and in aggregate and useful with additional analytics on top. So an example here would just be like Alice visited a malicious website. And this might be something that comes from your web tools that where you get tens of thousands of alerts around this a day or in a week. Through the process of identity resolution, we can link the different security tools together to build up insights. This lets us make assertions about the human based on collections of activity across a variety of different security tools. And we use a variety of different analytic techniques here. Some of these insights are built off of machine learning algorithms. Others are summary statistics or heuristic-based approaches, and others are just correlations of activity over a particular window of time across multiple tools. So an example here would be we detected Alice for the malicious web activity insight because she visited 3 or more malicious websites within the period of a week. Power insights are a convenience for simplifying complex logic over multiple different insights. So we can use Boolean logic to combine, say, maybe we have 6 or 7 different insights around phishing or 10 different insights around training activity. It lets us combine those into summary power insights that sort of highlight the behavior of all of those insights together. Example here would be unsafe browsing with malware. If Alice was already detected for that malicious web activity insight, but we also determined that malware was detected on one of the machines that she interacts with, we may flag her for this power insight. And ultimately, we take all of those insights together, look at how they have causal relationships among one another, and use that to estimate a likelihood of vulnerability on the risk and vigilance side. And I'm going to deep dive on that a little more. First, I want to briefly mention that that step of moving from activities to insights. A crucial component to making all of this stuff work is being able to tie those identities together. So identity resolution is just a process for linking identities coming from those various security vendors, security tools into a single human. This example here shows 2 different identities coming from 2 different tools and a variety of different aliases that might be used to describe them within those tools. And the process of identity resolution is really looking at these and probabilistically determining how likely is it that these 2 identities are the same person. When we have enough confidence around that, we'll take these 2 identities, or maybe a half dozen or a dozen identities, and bring them together as the same entity to empower correlated insights around correlated activity, as well as build out things like user device mappings, which users are using certain machines, and that can be used to power specific analytics in the HRI. I'm going to briefly kind of touch on the machine learning approach that we use to make this prediction of the likelihood of risk and vulnerability. Kind of starting from the top and moving down, we'll start with concrete observations at the top. And as you move down through the model toward the security categories in HRI, we move toward more abstract summarization of that activity. So the inputs to our analytic approach are primarily the insights. What's the behavior and threat that's being associated with humans in the organization? We have about 300 of these right now, and we kind of add on to these every week, depending on new integrations or new activity types that we're able to analyze. The other main input to this is impact modifiers. These are contextual information about individuals that allow us to adjust the impact of their risk of vulnerability. So for example, if we have all things being equal, we've got some users that are opening and clicking on phishing links, phishing websites, and entering sensitive information into those. And some of those individuals have elevated access or are on a performance improvement plan. These are impact modifiers that we can use to adjust the impact of that risk, because not all risks are equal. Somebody with elevated access could potentially have a higher impact on the organization if their credentials are stolen or they get or access is stolen otherwise. From those inputs, there are several intermediate or hidden layers in this this graphical model or Bayesian network, the machine learning approach that we use to calculate these probabilities. This is kind of the secret sauce that ties together all of these input variables, identifies causal relationships among them, and ultimately produces the vulnerability assessments across a number of different security categories, like data access, email, training, web security. All of these are we're predicting the likelihood of risk within each of those categories based on these primary insights and tuning them up and down based on the impact modifiers associated with those users. We do this process for both estimating the likelihood of risk as well as the likelihood of someone being involved in vigilant behavior. And then there's a mixture model that combines those to get us on that full spectrum of the kind of one being the on the risky side and 1,000 being highly vigilant. Yeah, so here I wanted to kind of just jump into a real world example that takes that high level machine learning model I was talking about on the previous page and show it kind of working and producing a risk score for a specific individual. This was pulled from a real customer profile. This person has a couple behaviors, a couple risky insights, as well as a couple vigilant insights. They've been opening simulated phishing emails and clicked on the links in the simulated phishing emails multiple times in, say, a 30-day period. They've also got their credentials reset recently according to configured company policy, and their EDR definitions have been kept up to date. Whether that's something, like as I mentioned earlier, whether that's something that was pushed by the security team or they had control over themselves, it's still kind of closing the loop on that and a vigilant behavior for that individual. These gray nodes in the middle are those are demonstrating those intermediate causal nodes that I mentioned before. So we see that as we move from these observable, recognizable things, did they open a fish? Did they click on that? Down to kind of more abstract behaviors like what's the likelihood of this individual doing something risky related to fish, their simulated fish hygiene. So we're correlating those things together and assessing how likely it is, given that we've seen these insights occurring for that individual. And of course, that blue layer is just the security categories talked about as well. So simulated and real fish, DLP policies may also feed into this, but ultimately to get an assessment of the likelihood of risk and the likelihood of vigilant across a few different security categories. The full model itself has hundreds of nodes at the input layer, several intermediate layers, and 6 security categories on both the vigilant and risk side. This is showing kind of a condensed subset of the model that's being activated specifically for this individual. And ultimately, the HRI model we balance risk and vigilant behaviors with a slightly higher weight toward risk. The idea being that risk in the organization needs to be addressed in part before the vigilance can bring that score up significantly. So this person's score sits in kind of the bottom quartile there at around 279 in the moderately risky or highly risky range. But that's not where we want to stop. The question is, well, what can we do about it for this individual? Or say that we had a group of individuals in the org or a department that all had similarly low scores. What can we do about it? So the goal here with the Unified platform is to bridge the gap between that observability and the metrics and the scoring that we can do around the individuals and the groups, and recommend impactful courses of action that can be taken to bring this score up and to address potential holes in the security posture. So this is just demonstrating a simulated example of what would happen if for this individual that previously had a score of 272 or so, and we were able to address their phishing, the introduction of risk or vulnerability through phishing and ultimately through the email security category. And this could be done by a number of different interventions, maybe pushing out targeted training, a nudge, communication on Slack, or some other workflow, either automated or manual, that targets this individual and says, look, you've got an issue with phishing. Here's what you can do about it. Here's how you can be more vigilant in the future. If we're able to address that, then we'll see that these observations go away and effectively the introduction of risk through that avenue goes down, ultimately bringing their score up, letting the vigilant actions that they're involved in shine. And lastly, I just want to close out with kind of an in-app view of all of this in action. So this is just one of the many ways that we have for kind of addressing that risk and introducing a workflow or a way to address the risk in the organization. This is an action plan that was targeted at a group of users that had elevated access. So one of those impact modifiers I talked about earlier. We've got several of people in this group that are on the risky or moderately risky side, and we want to shift that right. We want to see them become more vigilant, or at least get into that neutral range. And the idea here was looking at this group, we saw that several of them are not using MFA, not readily adopting MFA. So push out a communication to them, or send them a nudge that says, hey, look, you haven't set up MFA on your main accounts. We should go ahead and do that. And then we see that like within 30 to 45 days, we get a significant shift right in this distribution of users. Same people that previously were falling in this risky section are now being pushed into the higher HRI and the more vigilant sections. So I'll just pause there. I think we got a few minutes for questions. I'm also happy to take questions directly if you want to email me.
All right. Hey, Chris. I don't see any questions in yet. I'm curious, what was the hardest part of this is, and guys, we did not rehearse this. So we'll see how this goes. What was the hardest part? Like, what was the most complex part of creating this model when you first started trying to assess whether, measuring human risk and things of that sort? What was the most challenging part as a data scientist?
Yeah. The hardest part was, and I'm just going to actually jump ahead and just kind of show something here. I'm not going to speak to these slides, but the hardest part really is identifying the relationships among all of these different input variables. I mean, we have 300 or so different input variables that we want to model their causal relationships and how they affect and predict downstream risk or vigilance, and really tuning the hyperparameters in that model such that we're getting a realistic view of risk and testing that. The other big challenge that we have, and this is still a challenge today, is that the inputs to the model aren't the same for every organization. So what I mean by that is these insights, we're only able to capture, unify insights around behaviors or threats that the organization we're analyzing has integrations into. So the model can only really perform as well as the number of integrations and types of integrations that you've built. And we're constantly looking at that data, looking at new integrations to introduce new insights and tune those so that we can get a more holistic, more accurate prediction of risk vulnerability.
Yeah, and so that brings us to two questions very similar. Where do you pull data from to see people's actual behaviors? And the next question was, what are some good sources for analytical techniques in terms of define? Okay, so let's do the first one. Where are we pulling the data? Yeah, that's a great shot.
Yeah, exactly. This is just a subset of, but all of the security acronyms that you can think of. We've got DLP, we've got identity providers, we've got Windows logs, VPNs, CASB, firewall. I mean, really anything that's providing those behavior or threat indicators via logs or alerts. That's our primary source. We do have additional ways of bringing in data through custom uploads, historical loads, things like that.
So, yeah, Chris, that's really helpful. Yes, and so I want to ask one more question, and then there's a lot of great questions coming through that we can follow up on. There's some organizations in here that maybe not have budget or be able to afford bringing a product like this in house. How would you say a homegrown solution would work? Like if someone was like, I can't buy this right now, but like I want to prove out some of these ideas, how would you recommend somebody going about, being able to pull in data and making assertions?
Yeah, it's tough. So the first thing to do, and I mentioned identity resolution being a key component of this, pick two or pick three security vendors, security tools that you've already got integrated, and go through the exercise of finding, if you have access to the data, even finding yourself in that data and threading, you as the human through all of those different tools, and seeing how difficult, how easy, or how realistic of a holistic view of yourself you can get. Yeah, sort of almost like a POC of trying to understand your own data sources. But after that, it's really about being able to understand that data in aggregate and build um, identify the signals within all of that that you're interested in from a security standpoint.